We in 2 Timothy 4, verse 9 through 15. Y'all ready? Make every effort to come to me soon, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to the Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. Very interesting in the last part of the second letter to Timothy. Now, first thing you need to get in your mind, to get this picture in your mind, Paul has come to terms with the fact that he's not leaving Rome. He is going to die there. And so as he says these last things, and I broke this up because I just think it's important to take it in little sections, but basically all the rest of this is about preparing them for him to be gone. And I really focused on 15, be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. I think Paul wanted Timothy to understand that there's a whole lot of enemy in our midst that are supposed to be followers, but they're really not. Demas was supposedly learning and growing and discipling. And notice that when he had the choice between the two, he chose the world over following Jesus. There's a whole lot of people, I'm just going to tell you, that are going to come through our church and many other churches who are going to seemingly be working really hard for Jesus, but the glimmer of the world is going to turn their head. It just is. And I think Paul was trying to help Timothy understand everyone who is in your midst will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Everyone in your midst will not be what they claim to be. But you notice he didn't say reject them. He just said you be aware of them and you be on your guard against them. And you make sure that you understand that if those things happen, it's not a destruction of the church. It's not even a disappointment with Jesus, because Jesus knows who is and who isn't. In fact, Jesus himself said, I'm going to let the wheat and the tares grow up together. He's talking about in the church. He's not talking about in the world. And we will separate them in the end. He says, the sheep and the goats are together, and when they come before me, I will separate them out. The sheep on the right, the goats on the left. And the sheep will go to heaven, and the goats, well, they'll get theirs. But it's interesting that when he talks about Alexander, he says, the Lord will repay him according to his deeds. You notice that? It's very important that you and I understand that God knows your deeds. Whether I know your deeds or anybody in the church knows your deeds, God knows your deeds. And at some point, all that stuff will be tested. Mark Olson said, sin has a diminishing factor to it. It always gives its best in the beginning. It never gets better after that. It only gets worse. My kids used to have to glutton up cops so that I could show them, getting drunk, Budweiser commercial, and you're drinking and it's all good, ends up on cops at 2 a.m, and they're chasing you and putting you in jail. So, if you don't give them both sides of these things, then how could you expect them to understand or know? It's like social media. there's a lot of good things about social media. In this paper I'm writing, I'm really trying hard to write some good things about it, but my whole mindset is on really more of the bad things about it. But here's the sad thing. It don't take me but just a minute to find research that says it's bad. It's bad, it's bad, it's bad. There are some good points to it. The problem is, just like Demas, what happens is we take it to the max limits and we overdose on it, basically. And so now it's not a good thing anymore. I like to be able to go and find information. I like to go and learn and grow. But the problem is the same things you click to do that will send you to places you don't need to go, or hook you into things that you don't need to know. So sin always looks good in the beginning, but it always ends bad. I always think about what Adrian Rogers said. Sin will take you further than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay. Well, Alexander and Demas have lots of things to learn, right? It's not going to be probably good for them. Jerry White said, no one is so empty as the one who has stopped walking with God and doesn't know it. Think about that. I had to read it a couple of times to understand what he's saying, but what he's saying is when you are walking away from God and you don't know it, there's nothing more dangerous than that. When you think you're walking with God, but you're really not. And really what you're doing is you're lying to yourself, right? So I think about when I look at these verses, Paul knows that he's not ever leaving Rome. He's going to die there. And he still has things for Timothy to do. I know that because he wants the parchments. He wants the parchments so that he can give them to Timothy so they can be distributed the way they need to be distributed, right? But on the same thing, he says, you know, I'm leaving, and Crescens is gone, Titus is gone, Mark is gone, Luke is the only one here, so I need you to come and get these instructions before I die. Now think about that. How many of us think about what we need to make sure somebody knows before we die as far as it pertains to God? Most of us don't consider or think about that. But it's very important to Paul that the things that need to get done after he's gone. Now you would think, because Paul has made so many statements about heaven and how much he wants to be there, that he would say, you know what, y'all just figure it out yourself. It'll be all great. But he didn't. He was still burdened for all of these workers that were with him, but he was also burdened that Timothy knew that not only just these two men, but there are all kinds of men, Timothy, who are going to be against you. They're going to fight you every step of the way. And you need to be strong enough and you need to be powerful enough to be able to overcome it. Because if not, in our Sunday school class today, we were talking about our Christian struggles in this world. And we do have a lot of struggles and thinking about why people think the way they think and do the things they do. But when you go to Matthew 5 and Jesus sits down and he's talking to the disciples, but there's a whole crowd there, you just have to believe that Jesus saw the discouragement and frustration in them. And then he begins to talk about the Beatitudes, the blesseds are. Now, when you read them without encouragement and understanding, you think, well, this is depressing. But if you read them in the way that you know they're supposed to be, you say, what a blessing to know that even in the darkest times of my life, God is blessing me. Sometimes we don't realize that. Sometimes we don't think about that. But if we'll stay true to God's work and to God's course, and all of these people that he names, I wish that they had easier names to pronounce. You know, Luke and Mark were pretty nice, but the rest of them, they need to fix that, seem like to me. They need to find better ways. And we even got more than that in the next section, so I have to deal with that. But there was a lot of people that he named who are out doing the work that Paul has called them out to go do for God. Now think about that. You have all of these people who are out doing the things God's called them to do, and you only have two that he mentions that you need to watch out for, that you need to be on guard for, because all the rest of these people are off doing the things they're supposed to be doing. And I guess Paul probably thought Timothy was thinking, why you want me to come up there? Why do I have to come there? What's so important that you need me to come soon? Well, because all the rest of these folks are on the mission field. Everybody else is in the ministry doing their thing. And Timothy, you're going to be the new Paul. You're going to be the one who's going to lead all these people. I need you to come, and I need you to bring them parchments, and I need to help you understand how to go forward, and that you not only learn about these people who are not for you, you need to teach this to those people who are out in the ministry, because I'm fixing to die. I'm going to be gone. They're not going to hear from me anymore. He's sending on the legacy of Jesus. You realize that? Paul says when we go, when we die, it shouldn't stop with us. It should keep moving forward, because there should be people in our lives that we're teaching, that we're discipling, that when we're gone, it just never stops. Right? That's my goal for Calvary. If I was to die tomorrow, well, we don't have a plan. I want us to get to where we have a plan, that this just keeps moving forward. It doesn't stop because I died. And if you think about the last 14 years I've been here, a lot of people have died. A lot of people who impacted this area have died. And we need to build up people to take their places, and we haven't done such a great job of that. So I think what Paul is doing is he's saying, Timothy, you've been appointed the next leader, and so you need to come before I go, and we need to get this thing planned out so that you know how you're going and where you're going and how you're going to get there. And by the way, don't be so disappointed when I'm gone, because I'm going to heaven where you're going to go someday. Don't be disappointed in me being gone. Keep sharing the word. Keep telling the world about Jesus, and prepare somebody to take your place when you go. It's very important that all of us be disciplers as we are being discipled. That's the way God planned it. That's the way he made it. And that's what we got to do with it. So I think about 1 John 2 when I think about how we decide about how we're going to live. John said to the churches in 1 John 2, do not love the world nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. You see these two people? Paul says, listen, don't trust them anymore. They've made their choices and they've decided their things. And so you have to let them all go that way. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world, here's Paul's struggle, the world is passing away, and also its lust. This world's passing away. We need to be doing the things God's called us to do so we can be faithful to this world, because the last part of this, but the ones who does the will of God will live forever. The goal is that we don't allow the people who are going to lust after the world to infect us in the church, even though they're here. And he says very plainly, Alexander will get whatever it is coming to him. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. But here's the truth. He will repay us all according to our deeds. It's not just Alexander. We'll all be paid according to our deeds. And so it's very important that we know where we are and where we stand. Now, it was interesting as I was studying this, started talking about Mark and Paul and, how they had these issues and these problems. Verse 11 says, pick up Mark and bring him with you. Now, Mark is with Barnabas, right? He had done his ministry with him. But him and Paul had come to terms with their deal. Mark's older now. He's not that young whippersnapper. And, Paul said, you take that sucker with you because I ain't fitting to listen to his mouth no more. I'm done with him and his mess. But now you notice he says, pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me. See, we don't ever write anybody off 100%. Sometimes we have to step back and allow them to grow up or grow or whatever they need to do. But we never say, oh, yeah, I remember that sucker 10 years ago. No, he ain't coming with me. But I thought it was very interesting that Paul said, pick up Mark and bring him with me because he's got some stuff going on. And he's going to be useful in the service to God. We need to remember God is forgiven and we need to forgive. We need to remember that we're all imperfect. And maybe somebody's got the same problem with us that we have with somebody else. Maybe there was a time I introduced myself Saturday at this deal, and Randall Troll's there. And Randall Troll has been in my ministry ever since I started in 2000. And I told him, I said, there was times when Randall came and he would just look down, probably wanting to shake his head and say, he did not just say that. And he laughed, but we all have to learn and grow, right? The one thing he never did was he never, at the end of whatever at Pleasant Grove or Mount Moriah or here, none of them, he never said, hey, that was pretty pitiful. That was terrible. He never, ever said any of that. He just supported me. The people at the first church I was at, they were all older people who've been in the church all their lives pretty much. And I can assure you they shook their head many, many times as I started my preaching calling that God gave me. And none of them ever said, dude, you're terrible. They should have. They definitely could have, because there was times when I would just keep turning the page when the words were hard. I'd say, yeah, we're not reading that one. And I'd turn, no, we're not going to read that one. I couldn't pronounce the words. I had no clue what they said, Didn't even know how you were supposed to learn them. So we all need to think about the same thing Paul does here. We all need to be walking beside young Christians. And I don't mean young in age. They might be 50 years old, but young in their Christian walk. Because I'm going to tell you, learning the Bible is not easy. It is not. Learning what the Bible says to us to do is not easy. And if we just give people the patience, and sometimes you can tell them, and it's still not going to matter, right? Until they learn it themselves. You think about Mark. Paul told him, hey, buckaroo, knock that off. Did it work? No. Paul said, Barnabas, you take him. He ain't coming with me. Done with that. Now, everybody says all God was doing with that was he was sending out 2 teams instead of 1. I don't dispute that. But really, that wasn't the centerpiece of it. The centerpiece of it was God was sending Mark with someone who could disciple him because Paul wasn't that person. And you think about how great Paul is and all the things Paul did, but he couldn't disciple Mark. You see, we all have our limits. We all are good at things and we're all not so good at things. And if we do the things that we're good at, well, then we create Marks who will be a great service someday to the ones who he annoyed in the beginning. But if we do a bad service, Mark won't only not do a good service for them, but he just won't do a service at all because he gets frustrated and says, well, I guess I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough for this thing. So just like Paul, we ought to be focusing more on who are we going to leave behind to do the work God's called us to do now. Now, I may be going to hurt feelings here in what I'm fixing to say, but that's okay because God's word sometimes hurts feelings. If we're not doing the ministry God's called us to, how are we going to disciple somebody else to do it when we're gone? If we're not doing it now, how are we going to teach them to do it when we're gone? That's a tough question. And there's a lot of people who are in churches who are just sitting in the pews and getting by, and they're not preparing anybody for the ministry. And everybody is called to the ministry. Don't think you're not called to the ministry. Everybody's called to the ministry. Not everybody's called to preach. Not everybody's called to teach, but everybody's called to the ministry. And discipleship is just something we're all supposed to do. Now, what Paul did was discipled lots of folks. He just couldn't disciple Mark. And it's not that you don't disciple anybody, it's that you disciple people you can disciple, and then you let other people disciple the people you can't, right? But in the end, the truth is, everybody needs to be discipled. 1 Timothy 1:18, Paul writes, "This command I entrust to you, Timothy, my son, fight the good fight, keeping faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected and suffered shipwreck in regard in their faith. Among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander." What? "Whom I have handed over to Satan, so that they will be taught not to blaspheme." Did you hear that? Paul. You turn somebody over to Satan? You know what that means? Paul's not saying he's got some great power pool. What he says is, if you're going to live life for Satan, then go live life for Satan, but don't be doing that here. So basically what he says is, they are no longer disciples of mine. They're now disciples of Satan. Why? Because they're living that way. Because they are not living for God, they're living for themselves. And notice, Paul doesn't say, I will repay him according to his deeds. God will. God's going to handle that. I don't have to do that. But look at it in verse 15, "Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching." Those who are our enemies vigorously oppose our teaching. They are our enemies. But Paul didn't handle it himself. Paul turned it over to God. You know why? Because Paul says, I don't have time for this silliness. I need to be telling people about Jesus. Lord, he's yours. You do with him whatever you want. He's not going to participate in ministry with me ever again. He's yours. You change his heart and you change his mind, well, great, send him back. But if you don't, well, you'll repay him. You'll do for him. And sometimes we forget that, or sometimes we just think we need to be in charge, or we need to be able to handle things, or I'm the one who can break you. No, you're not. It's not our job to break people. It's our job to love people. It's our job to disciple people. It's our job to teach through illustration, through how we do things to people. And whether they learn or not, it's their choice. Paul spent much time with Alexander and Demas. And in the end, what did he say? Well, one deserted me, the other one opposed me. But look at how fast he moved on from that. He said that one sentence, and then he goes on to talk about all of these great people who are doing great ministries all over where he's at. You see, because Paul says, I don't have time to deal with silliness. God's going to deal with that. What I'm going to focus on is telling people about Jesus and giving people an opportunity to come know him. So there's a few things that, with all of that introduction, we need to think about. The long introduction, maybe. But I think it's important. In your ministry, in your investment of others, and you should be investing in others. If you're not investing in others, you are not doing what God's called you to do. In your investment with others, you're going to be disappointed sometimes. It is just life. But if, like Paul, you will say, okay, I did what God asked me to do. They've made their choice. The world's more important to them than God. I move on to the next whoever God gives me to disciple. Do you see? I don't keep mourning or struggling with the time I've spent with whoever. Time that we spend with others discipling them about Jesus Christ is never a waste of time. Never. And it either brings them to him or it separates them from him, but that's on them because they have to make that choice. But like Paul, when you recognize it, you see it, and it happens, then you have to move on. Secondly, I think Paul says, none of us do ministry alone. Look at all the people who were doing all that ministry all around the world at that time. Only two, he said, were basically out of the loop. But all the rest of them, they were around the world telling folks about Jesus. And by the way, Paul had influence on every one of them. You can go to other letters and you can see where Paul had influence over every one of these people. And now they're doing the work that God called them to do. Why? Because Paul was faithful and he did what God called him to do, and he discipled people. Any one of us who thinks that we can do this alone, we haven't read the Bible. We don't do this alone. That's the reason church is so important, because we need to come to church and we need to be strengthened. We need to be gathered together. We need to be loving one another. We need to be sharing with each other people we need to be praying for. There's all kinds of things we need to do. And one of the most important things is we need to worship together. If you study the Old Testament, they went to the temple every day worshiping together. Every day. And some who can sing will sing. That's great. If you can't hum, that's great. But worshiping together makes a bond that nobody can tear apart, especially Satan, and the deceiver's always trying. Do you think, well, I just made a whole list of things Paul went through. Let me see if I can find it. Paul 5 times was beaten with 39 stripes. 3 times he was beaten with a rod. Once he was stoned and left for dead. 3 times he suffered shipwreck, spent the night and a day in the deep ocean. He was in danger among false brethren. He was thrown into dungeons. He made no special cry for help. He even became a martyr for Christ. And in all of that stuff, you know what Paul did? He just kept making disciples. And we say, they didn't get my sandwich right at Burger King. I'm going to burn the whole thing down. You notice I didn't use Whataburger. We ain't burning Whataburger down. Burger King we can, but not Whataburger. We say, you know, I shared Jesus with that guy, and he said, hell's good for him. Can you believe that he would say that to me? Yeah. I haven't met anybody personally who's been through all the things Paul went through, and yet we quit ministry so quickly over whatever. They looked at me wrong. They said I wasn't dressed right. They told me to move from my pew. Not doing that. Paul was beaten, stoned, imprisoned, and in the end of his life, he says, Timothy, make every effort to get here before I die, because I'm not through discipling you yet. Think about that. I'm not through discipling you yet. You need to get here and bring them parchments, because there's stuff in them that's got to go. You got to go tell the churches about these things. See, for me, that's a very powerful thing that Paul would say, we're never through with our ministry until God takes us home. Now, Paul wasn't dying of cancer. He wasn't on hospice. He was in prison in chains. His death wasn't coming from an illness. His death was coming from the Roman government. And yet he still says, there's work to be done. There's work to be done. And he understood he couldn't do it alone. Third, I want us to understand that whatever people God brings into our lives, and I think as we move forward at Calvary, there's going to be people who come here who are not like us. They're going to be different. They're going to think different. They're going to look different. But in the end, we're all going to have the same Jesus. And in the end, we're all going to have the same goals. So we have to learn how not to judge people by their first impressions or by the things they do in the beginning. Like Paul and Mark, we need to disciple these people and then let them decide, do they choose the world or do they choose God? And you say, well, I've invested all that in them and then they went back. Well, here's the mindset. Are you doing this for you or are you doing this for Jesus? If you're doing this for you, well then sure, it's going to bother you. If you're doing this for Jesus, you're going to say what Paul says, Lord, you repay them for their deeds. Send me the next one to disciple. Let them go do whatever it is they're going to do. If we spend our lives pondering on the ones we fail with, will we ever have any successes? Probably not. Because we're going to spend our time saying, what's the purpose and the effort? But if we spend our time saying, Lord, I'm going to disciple, and you're going to change the heart. I'm going to do my part, and you're going to do your part, and then they have to choose to do their part. I'm afraid for most of us, at least at this moment, we don't do our part. And when we're not doing our part, well, then God says, how can anybody else do theirs? I've called you to do something, and you haven't done it. And Paul says, I'm fixing to die, but I need to leave some things with you because making disciples is important. Telling people about Jesus is important. And finally, I think what we learn in these verses is that Paul says, you're always going to have resistance. Always. Just get used to it. You're always going to have people who are going to fight against you, yes, in the church. It's just the way it is. And it's interesting that in our meeting yesterday, all the churches, we were talking about people who have been in the churches throughout the years who, in seminary, they called them the cowbell churches. They wore the cowbell. If you know about dairies, the bell cow was the lead to the barn. Ding, 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 ding. So in seminary, they called them the cowbell people because they were the leaders of everything. And they said, find those people and change their hearts, and you'll change the whole atmosphere of the church. And I believe that's true. I believe that when we all have a heart for discipleship and we all have a heart for doing what God wants us to do and what God's called us to do, and we're all on the same page, we'll all be ready to do the work that God's got us to do. And then I found this statement I thought was very important, and I didn't put the person's name. I don't even remember who I found this from. But he made this statement about these scriptures, and he said, Paul's confidence was in this. God was present, God was powerful, and God was faithful. And he says, in our day and in our lives and in our ministries, God is present, God is powerful, and God is faithful. And we should be ready to fight the fight, to serve God, to do the things he's called us to, because he's with us. And then he used this verse, Psalm 46, 1 and 2. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea. God is our refuge. And we should never measure what happens in our lives according to this world. We should always measure what happens in our lives according to the promise of God. And yes, we all get frustrated. Yes, we all get angry at times with people and life and the things that happen. But just remember, everything we do as Christians, we're doing for the kingdom to come, not the kingdom that's here. This world is passing away, but we're not. So I'm reminded of Galatians chapter 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I don't live my life for me. I live my life for Christ. And like Paul, if I live my life for Christ, do I have a whole list of names of people that I have been a part of the discipleship with them? Do I have a list of people that I can say, you know, when I die, they're going to keep carrying on and they're going to keep doing the things that need to be done and they're going to keep moving forward? The whole struggle with me in this church is if I die tomorrow, and I'm not saying the church will shut down, but will this church keep moving forward? And will the church be doing what it needs to do to reach people for Jesus? And yeah, you can find a whole lot more better preachers than me for sure. But are we built and ready for that? Are we strengthened for that? Paul had a whole, what he would call, world to deal with, and he had all of these folks who were already in all of these places doing the ministry. And yet he was still worried that when he died, they wouldn't have got it all. Timothy, you come quickly. because I got things to tell you before they kill me. I'm still blown away at the fact that Paul's not saying, why I got to die? I've just been faithful, done everything God's called me to do, and now I'm going to die. Never did he say that. Here's the thing. Go back and read all those things I said happened to him, being whooped and beaten and stoned and all that. He never complains that happened. He never says, can you believe that God would let me go through all that, as obedient as I've been to him? He never says anything about any of those things. He just gets up. Go back and read them. He gets up and he goes and he preaches again. You may stone me and try to kill me, but God ain't ready. So let me stand up here and tell you about Jesus. You may beat me, but God ain't ready. Let me tell you about Jesus. You may shackle me and put me in the dungeon, but I'll never stop singing about Jesus. Go back and read Acts, and you will see Paul never, in anything that happened to him, stopped preaching, stopped singing, or stopped discipling. And that's what we have to do. That's where we have to be. Like Paul, we should be able to say, the Lord has blessed me with this many disciples, and I've done my best to my ability to teach them and to lead them and to show them what it is, so that when I die, they start making disciples, and then they start making disciples. But I'm afraid we failed that, not just at Calvary, but in churches throughout the world today, especially in America. It's almost like we think, well, we're a big building. Surely people can see us. Well, they do. They pass by you every day because they don't believe they're invited here. And even if they are, we're some whacked out cult with some big fat gray-haired preacher that won't shut up. You know, he talks for 45 minutes twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday. And who knows what he's saying? He can't speak English, much less all the rest of that stuff that's in that Bible. So we have to go show them what Jesus is. We have to be that so they can see, not only are you welcome, but the peace of God will be with you if you will just come to know Christ as your Lord and Savior. Life's going to keep moving on. Struggles are coming, but God will be with you. Trust in him. I thought these were some pretty interesting verses tonight that Paul wrote. And it doesn't really ever say if Timothy got there quickly or not. So we don't know that, but maybe he did. But even if he didn't, Timothy was trained up enough to know what he was supposed to do. And all these others that Paul had discipled knew what they were supposed to do. Paul just knew that his ministry didn't stop until he was dead. And man, if we can get there, wow, we can move all the earth. Well, if you'll bow your heads, I'll dismiss us. Father, God, I thank you so much for Paul and his words to remind us that, Lord, we all are to live until you take us home. And as we live, we are to always be seeking after your will, making disciples, teaching others about you, showing them through our own lives how to live. And Lord, I pray that when we die, we will be able to say, there are many that we have discipled that will continue to share the word. Father, tonight, maybe you're preparing people to become our disciples. Maybe they don't even know you yet. Maybe they need to come to know you. Would you open their hearts and minds tonight? Would you help them to see their need? And Lord, would you draw them near to us that we could begin the process